how to find a flexible job that doesn't derail your career. Tami Forman is the chief executive of Path Forward, a nonprofit organization that creates mid-career internship programs to ease the transition back to work for women and men after taking a break for raising children or other caregiving responsibilities. Path Forward has worked with more than 80 employers, including Amazon, Netflix, Walmart, Apple, Comcast, NBC Universal, Verizon, and SAP, just to name a few. She is a frequent speaker on issues related to women's participation in the workforce, having presented at the Grace Hopper Celebration, Disrupt HR, Tech Inclusion, and the Conference Board's Women's Leadership Conference. She writes a career column for Forbes, is a Fairy Godboss VIP, and was named by FlexJobs as one of the top 20 career experts for working moms. Welcome, Tami. All right, joining Tami in conversation, we have Lauren Haggerty here, who is the Director of Marketing and Community at Power to Fly. Lauren is a passionate community builder looking to forge meaningful connections between humans and brands, making a difference. Take it away, both of you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Mariella.
Yes, thank you, Mariella. I appreciate you. And hi, Tami. Welcome. It is a pleasure being here and getting to host you today. So thank you so much.
Lauren, I'm so excited about this conversation. It's going to be great.
Me too. I can't believe we only have 30 minutes. So I'm going to
we're going to get to it.
Yes.
We're going to do it.
Mariella did a great job introducing you and a little bit more about Path Forward and what y'all are looking to achieve, helping returners, and especially in this conversation, find flexible work. Can you just tell us a little bit more about, why you got started in this business and what you're really passionate about?
Yeah, so the concept of a returnship is something that's been around for a little while. And I was working for a small software company in New York that decided to implement the program for themselves. And had some other companies reach out and ask for help setting up their own returnship programs. And that kind of snowballed into a bunch of the execs of that company, including me, deciding to start a nonprofit because we saw this opportunity. And I think it segues into flexible work in a really interesting way, which is sometimes the reason people leave the workforce for caregiving is really that they weren't able to get the flexibility they needed at work, right? So there's all kinds of reasons why people leave the workforce for caregiving, but we heard from many people, especially many women, that my boss wouldn't let me work from home one day a week. I couldn't, there were too many vacations and I couldn't get any flexibility around school holidays and things like that, like all these things that just made it really difficult for them. And then we saw what happened with the pandemic when the bottom falls out of any kind of social structure around support for families. So we started this company in 2016, but frankly, the work feels more important than it ever has.
Absolutely. And I feel like this conversation is something that's not only, in the news every day, but as we kind of tick closer to this, in-person start again date, we're having to make really hard decisions and have hard conversations. So I'm excited to dive in a little deeper. And something I thought was super interesting about putting this conversation together was this idea about how, work from anywhere policies, obviously right now they can be used to the advantage of an employee, but there are also policies that are both good and bad for professionals. Can you talk a little bit about why this is and what you would consider a bad policy or what to look out for?
Yeah, absolutely. And something I said in a talk I was in recently was that flexible policies have always hurt women's careers for two completely opposite reasons, right? So one reason is women couldn't get the flexibility that they needed, right? So the thing I just talked about, right? And they ended up leaving the workforce instead of being able to stay, maybe working in a different capacity or in different ways, right? And then there's the other side of it, which many companies have had flexible policies over the last few years. And we'll talk about the pandemic in a second, but since the 90s into the 2000s, a lot of companies have had flexible policies. They too often have derailed that woman's career, right? They've become the mommy track. And look, I think the pandemic has kind of shaken everything up in a lot of ways. And it's it's creating flexibility in places where it never was before, and creating new ways of thinking about flexibility. And there are certainly some companies out there being very thoughtful about those policies. But let's not kid ourselves, right? Like, women's workforce participation rates are at the lowest level that they have been since 1988. There's a reason for that, right? It is not actually like, it doesn't necessarily have to have been the case that just because the schools closed, the moms left work, right? There could have been other people who might have left work. Right? Like, right, there was a way this happened, and there's a way it unfolded, and it unfolded in a very gendered way. For most people, right? Your mileage may vary, but for most, when you look across the workforce, it unfolded in this very gendered way. And if we don't think about that as we enact policies going forward, particularly corporate policies, we're going to end up in a place that will be better for individual women, which makes me happy, but maybe not better for us overall in terms of where women's careers go, and leadership. And if we tie too much of the flexible policies the way we did in the past to, okay, well, that's for moms or other people, but it's not for people who are on the fast track to the corner office, we're going to end up in the same place we're in now, which I don't think many of us want when it comes to leadership.
Let's dig into some of those policies, because I think that's a really fascinating point. How, especially given the moment we're at with the Great Resignation and the Great Rehiring, people are jumping ship and joining new companies. It feels like every other day. How should one evaluate a company's flexible working policy, keeping in mind that potential impact on one's career and personal life? How can we go in with as much information as possible to make a really strong decision?
Yeah, and look, more and more companies are putting this information out, in public, and I generally recommend people wait until pretty far into the process to start having those conversations. The conversation itself, depending on the company, might derail you earlier in the process. So I tend to but there's a lot of things you can learn about a company as you're going without coming right out and saying, well, can I do this or can I do that? So asking about culture, asking about working styles, working the culture, like those kinds of things. There's a lot of great ways to ask culture questions that aren't like, oh, how much vacation do I get, right? Which is sort of that thing you want to think about. But I think certainly you can look at the individual policies. Do they allow work from home? What are their policies around remote? How much do they allow working alternate hours if you need to? What kind of PTO policies do they have, right? So you can look at the specific policies, and often those will be on the website or provided to you as part of like an offer, right? Something you can get information about, but it's less about the specific policy and more about how they get enacted, right? So that comes to like looking at a leadership team, for example. Like, if everyone in the leadership team is frankly a guy who's got, a stay-at-home wife, that tells you something about who succeeds at that company. It may still be the right company for you, right? This is partly about figuring out what you need and also what your career goals are. So that's like getting straight in your head, and that may change over the course of your career. One thing I tell people is like, don't get stuck in one place if that place isn't the right for this stage of your career. But those are some things that you can look at, like asking questions about what it takes to move forward in a company, who's in the leadership team, how they connect as a company, right? If the answer to how we connect as a company is we hang out and drink on Thursday nights, that's one answer, right? If it's like, oh, we do these offsites that take place on the weekends, that's an answer, right? So kind of getting a sense of how the policies are practiced versus just what those policies are.
That's a great answer. And I'm actually super interested to dive into something that you said, which was you don't recommend asking about flexible policies or work from home early in the interview process. That's something that we do at Powerfly very early, but I think that's something that's just been baked into our culture. We're all totally remote. Why do you suggest waiting, or how do you bring that up? And I love the idea of the culture questions diving in, but I also feel like there comes a point where you just need to be explicit with your needs. So how do you
Oh,
navigate that?
absolutely. And again, I think there's a lot of things you can learn. First of all, there are companies that are becoming more forthcoming about this information early in the process, and I applaud that. I'm also a salary transparency fan, so like more transparency, please. Like put it all out there. Don't make people ask these questions, actually. That would be my message to employers would be just like put it out there. Like make it clear what your culture is, what your practices are, what your goals are for the kinds of company that you're trying to create. Don't make people ask. The sad fact of the matter is women get judged when they ask these questions, and they get judged differently from how men get judged, right? And there's a bias that people have about women wanting flexibility. Now, it is very possible that that is changing and will change over the next couple of years as we've all been through this experience. I'm a little, I don't know that human beings change that quickly. Like, I don't know that inherent bias around gender roles is going to magically disappear because we all just realize like, oh, that was kind of not so great, right? Like, I think it's going to take a little more work on all of our parts, right, to change that systemic bias that people have about women and caregiving and what they're meant to be doing and what they should be doing, and then what that means for us when we're hiring someone and what we think about them. So that's sort of, I think it's, and some of it is about how you ask these questions versus whether or not you ask these questions, right? Questions about the work culture, how does the team connect? How do you get work done? What happens when a deadline comes up? Like there's all kinds of ways to get at the question without, again, saying like, well, how much vacation will I get? And can I work from home? I think those things start to come off a little bit more like, what about me? And you can frame it a little bit more like, I'm trying to figure out if this is a place where I can thrive. So tell me about how you work together as a team. And that's going to tell me what I need to know. The actual policies are pretty easy to get, towards the end of the process, which is when you're really evaluating whether or not this is the right place. But you should have a good sense by asking some of these other culture questions before you get there.
I love that. And that nicely segues into this next question, actually, which is how can we have conversations with employers or potential employers about our own family's needs in relation to flexible work? So I like what you just said about, how can I thrive? How can I like make you more successful? But I think, many times we are, putting our families first and thinking about them, and that greatly impacts our career paths, our successes at the companies, and so on. So how do we navigate those conversations?
Yeah. So I think it's funny. I'm going to say something that sounds a little bit the opposite, but again, it's partly about like where you are in the process. I do think it's really good to be very clear with people about what you need. And I think that when people get jammed up around some of these issues, it's when they're trying to kind of, and this is, some of us do this just sort of naturally, try to please everybody, right? We're trying to please the boss. We're trying to please our partners and our family. We're trying to please, everybody just like, okay, is everybody happy? And no, no, everyone's not happy, and especially you a lot of times. So I think actually partly it's about getting clarity with your family and the people around you as well about like how are we as a team at home going to share work and make sure that everybody's supported and fulfilled and getting what they need, and that we're not making those decisions in a gendered way. So that's one piece of it. And then, okay, assuming that piece, then what do I need from this company to make me successful here? And look, some of this is going to vary a little bit by personal circumstances. Like if you really need a job right now, you may have less room to maneuver and you may have to kind of figure out what that looks like. But if you have more space, whether you have a job and you're just looking for a better one, or you're looking for a job but you have time on your side, that's where you can think about how you want to really evaluate those policies and think about where there's flexibility within the flexible policies. But being super clear with the person that you're about to work with, I think is really helpful. I think part of that is also about conveying your desire to be successful, right? And do a great job and show value for this company. And this is what I need to do that. And giving examples of where in your career you've had that kind of latitude and flexibility and been able to be really successful and drive results for the company.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to think that, we talk about and give advice for these conversations that we're having with our managers, the leadership team, colleagues, et cetera. But I almost think that in relation, having these conversations with our families, our partners, our, inner circle that's taking care of the busy work at home, because again, flexible work does mean balancing the workday with those unpaid tasks that many times women are taking, the majority of stakeholdership in. So how do we approach those conversations and recognize that, yes, we have to balance those tasks or delegate them to someone else? How do you coach people on navigating that?
Yeah, and unpaid labor is a big conversation that's happening right now in the culture, right? Because it's becoming more and more visible to people how much of that is being borne by women across, again, systemically. Different families arrange things in different ways, but across the culture, it's definitely borne much more by women. There's a couple of great books that I recommend for people. I have always loved Tiffany Dufu's Drop the Ball. It's very personal, it's very raw, but it's also very prescriptive in a good way. Like she really kind of offers a framework for how to figure out with your partner how to divide the work. And doing that in a way that does not rely on gender roles as like the starting point. A more recent book, Fair Play by Eve Roski, is another favorite of a lot of people. If you're a fan of gamification, of like the game theory way to do these things, it's again offers a really helpful framework that dispenses with the idea that like, well, that's a mom task, that's a dad task, that's a wife task, that's a husband task, that kind of thing. So I think there's some great frameworks out there. It's about having the conversation, which can be really tough for a lot of people. And understandably, it is very personal and it's very, you have dynamics that are in place and disrupting those dynamics can be tricky. And a lot of people, I think, aren't necessarily expecting that to happen when you have kids. You kind of think like, oh, we're all past that, right? It was sort of like we're post needing to worry about these kinds of things. And then you have kids and all of a sudden everybody's like, wait, how are we doing this again? Wait, was this supposed to work? And it can be disorienting for a lot of people. So knowing that going in is helpful.
I appreciate that answer so much. And Tiffany is one of our beloved past speakers. So she's incredible. We'll have to drop the link to her chat in the chat here, but I love that. And we will definitely send out those books if they're not in the chat already, because I've read the first one. It's amazing. Drop the Ball.
Yeah.
Great. So we only have about 10 more minutes left. I see there are some questions coming in from the audience. I highly encourage if anyone has a question for Tami, now's the time to ask it. But I want to get to this last question here that I have for you, Tami, which is, what do you foresee about the future of flexible working policies? And as you mentioned earlier, I think they're changing, as of the last month, let alone the last year, 2 years that we've been in the global pandemic. So if you were to say right now how it's changing, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is anyone who tells you they know what the future of work is a lying liar who lies, because it's just too hard right now. It's all in flux. I do think there's some things we can start to predict, right? Like the genie is out of the bottle around a certain amount of remote work, right? I just think the days of like commuting into an office to stare at a computer for 8 hours, that doesn't make sense. And politicians can rail and corporate executives can rail, and nevertheless, it's just not going to make sense for people. These policies, I think we're going to see over the next couple of years, like waves of change in corporate policy that are responding to changes in the way the employee base responds to those policies, that then drives more policy change, which then drives more response, which then right, like we're going to see a couple rounds of this, because the thing about the workforce is it's pretty complicated. It's both complicated and complex. And so people don't just like quit their job because their company has a policy they don't like. Like it's just not that immediate. So there's going to have to be the change. Some people are going to try to see how it works out. Some people are going to start looking immediately. And then, companies will make adjustments, and it will vary by teams and all kinds of things. So there's going to be all kinds of moving parts. But I think hybrid is here to stay. I think figuring out how to do hybrid equitably, and I mean that both from a gender perspective, but from all the others, right? Disability, race, all the things, right? All the ways that we show up in the workforce, right? Having hybrid be something that is equitable across your employee base and does not just continue to advantage the same people who've been advantaged for many decades now is going to be tricky. And I don't want to actually underplay how hard I think it's going to be for corporate executives to figure out how to do that. But that's going to be the thing. I think you're going to see more and more remote only companies, actually. Like, I think that was a trend we were seeing before, and it's going to accelerate. So I think those are a couple things that we can be sure of, and everything else, I think we're going to have to see how it plays out.
I feel that, and it also gives me so much anxiety because there's so much that we could do in ways that we can help companies in a good way.
Yeah.
But great questions coming in here. So I'm going to get to as many of these as possible. So someone says, I read in the New York Times last week that companies are starting to open their offices back up as early as this week. What advice do you have for people who don't want to return back to the office? And how do you approach that conversation with your manager?
Yeah, I mean, so different companies are instituting different policies, and I think it's important to read the tea leaves and see, like, is this something that they're really gunning for? And what is that going to mean for you if you express that? There has never been a better time, I think, in the United States to be looking for a job, and to be looking for a job that offers remote and flexible options. So that's certainly something you can think about. It depends on, what your career goals are and all of those other things. And you can also kind of see how it plays out. I think there's going to be a certain amount of, I feel like I want to call it corporate civil disobedience, right? It's hard to police this stuff. It was hard to police it before. It's harder to police it now. Right. What managers, I think it's definitely good to get a vibe from your direct manager and the people on your team. Like, how are we feeling about the return to office scenario? It may also be that you want to think about going back. If they are offering hybrid, you may want to try how that works out for you, and not like, I just really don't like to tell people to like back themselves into a corner. Like, maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe you won't mind it. Maybe having some interaction is actually helpful. And then again, it comes back to like, is it being done equitably and all of these things? But you have plenty of time to look for another job if it turns out that it's not quite working the way you were hoping it would. So that's some ways to think about it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I love the advice to try it out too. I think many of us are missing that connection. So it's interesting to hear who's excited to go back and who is dreading it. But anyways, Putera is actually asking, do you think there will be compensation differences for hybrid / on-site / remote work? Maybe even bonus stipends for those that do end up commuting into the office?
Yeah, that's going to be, I would put that in the category of things that's going to be really hard to predict, because there's a couple different trends in compensation right now that are all happening at the same time, right? So one is all the things we just talked about, right? Hybrid and remote and work from anywhere and yada, yada. And then the other thing is all this stuff around salary transparency and the gender pay gap, which like just keeps like rolling along. I think it's New York City is going to have pay transparency. Colorado had pay transparency a year or two ago. So you're starting to see companies. So I actually think when salaries start to become more transparent, you could actually see the opposite thing happening, which is high cost salaries in high cost places start to filter to low cost places, right? Where everybody's like, well, if they're making that much, right? And this has always been a challenge for companies. This is a long-standing challenge for companies that have been geographically distributed, because here's the thing, employees talk to each other and people figure it out, right? So it's like it's always been there, and savvy employees hint, hint, who are the savvy employees, have always used that kind of stuff to their advantage and figured out how to get themselves the best packages they can get. But I think the concept of salary transparency sort of opens up the door to everyone having a better sense of what different jobs are compensated at, and what to ask for. So I think it's unclear still. Salary transparency could work in the opposite direction, in the way of saying like, nope, this is what we pay in this location and this is what we pay in that location, and we're going to be transparent about it, but that's what it is. And it may be easier for companies because it's open to stick with that, right? It may be harder for some employees to negotiate a raise in some places. So I think that's one of those ones that's still a little up in the air, depending on how those two sort of parallel tracks kind of meet.
Absolutely. I think we're just at the precipice of figuring all this out. And like you said, I think it's going to be a lot of employees leading the way and spearheading where policy goes in the next, 30, 60, 90 days, let's say, even beyond. But this was all incredible information, Tami. Before I kind of send us off, can you just let the audience know how they can connect with you, how they
Yeah,
can learn
absolutely.
more about the path forward? Like, give us all your details.
Yeah. So you can go to pathforward.org. Very simple, all one word, pathforward.org. We have lots of great stuff for people. We have webinars that we run regularly that have all kinds of great information. Sign up for our newsletter. You'll hear about returnship opportunities, our events, all of that great stuff. You can also always send an email to hello@pathforward.org if you have a question that is not answered on our website or through our FAQ. So I see those emails. Everybody on our team sees those emails. So feel free to drop us a line, and we can direct you to the right resources at our company that will help you.
Well, thank you so much, Tami. This has been lovely. I've really enjoyed the last 30 minutes and learning from you. And I really can't wait to see what happens in the world and in the world of flexible work.
I know. It's going to be fascinating. Lauren, thank you so much. This was great. I really enjoyed it.